Hey guys, it's Melissa here from melissaopen.com. Welcome to another episode of Awaken Your Inner Awesomeness. I am so delighted you're here with me today because we have a very special guest. Today we have with us Dr. Kimberly Harms. She is an author, mother, widow, teacher, leader, and spokesperson. And she's here today to talk to us about finding purpose in pain and navigating grief and creating a wonderful life that we love. And that, yes, that is possible even after we've experienced grief. And I know that so many of you out there, as myself, have experienced grief recently. And I'm excited to find out exactly how we can navigate this really difficult journey. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Kimberly.
Thank you so much for having me here, Melissa. This is great.
So before you get started talking about the grief journey, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Obviously, if you have written books about this, you must have some sort of expertise in grief. So how exactly did you become such an expert in this field?
Well, I think I just through my life, I'm 67 years old, almost 68 in a couple of weeks. And I think if you ask most people my age, they will have gone through some sort of grief in their life. When I was born, my mother had taken some thalidomide, which is a drug that causes arms and legs and fingers, in my case, to be missing. And she was a hand model, so that started, right away. They were worried about me and my growing up. And my mom, when I was 17, took her own life. She was a wonderful mother. She was bipolar. She had some issues, but she was the most loving, kind, caring, wonderful mother, which I think is just proof in my mind that you being mentally ill does not prevent you from being a good parent. And so I just really want to say that she was a great mom. When I was 17, she took her own life. She was at a very dark point, and it was obviously devastating for me. So I had to reinvent myself at that point, right? And I think in my life, what I've learned at my age is that you have to reinvent yourself a number of times because all the plans that you kind of make when you're young don't always work out the way you expect them to. So I had to do it the first time then. I fell in love with this man in University of Maryland who wanted to be a dentist. So I thought, oh, well, this was 1974. So it was a different world. So please do not mimic this behavior. It's wrong. But because he was so cute, I thought, well, maybe if I was a dentist, he'd marry me, right? That's what we thought back in those days. Please don't think that anymore. But anyway, what happened was that started my journey in dentistry. I went to my advisor and I said, hey, my grades are really great and so on. I said, I think I want to be a dentist. What do you think? But, I only had 7 fingers. So I thought that maybe that might have a little bit of an effect on that. And he said, well, of course, there's no way no one's going to ever take you in dental school with only 7 fingers. So give it up. And so I did. For a second or two, I gave it up and I thought, well, he's probably right. I'd never heard of any 7-finger dentists, so probably not going to happen. And I got up and left. But again, this was 1974. He was sitting back in his chair with a big cigar in his mouth, putting his feet up on the desk. And as I walked out the door, he said, well, maybe if you were a man, they would let you in. He said that to me.
Wow.
Oh my gosh, it was the best gift ever because I was so mad at him at that point that I was going to dental school by hook or by crook. So I changed advisors instead of changing careers, went to another advisor who was equally scary at first, but turned out to be a fabulous advisor, Dr. Potter, who told me, when I said, I think I go to dental school, she said, I don't know. Let me find out, which of course changed my life because she put my concerns over the concerns about her own ego of knowing everything, right? She changed my life. So I went down to the dental school. I said, hey, can I be a dentist? And they looked and said, well, can your right hand hold the mirror? And I said, yep, it can hold a mirror. So they said, one hand goes to dental school, one hand holds the mirror. You're good. You're good. And so and of course, just to top it off, I got the guy. So I got the career and the guy, so that worked out well. But please do not follow my example. That is no way to choose a profession. It just happened to work out for me. So that's where I got started. So I had to kind of reinvent myself several times. I went to dental school, did very well, started a practice in Farmington, Minnesota, had wonderful many years in this beautiful small town, 3 children. And then when my youngest son, Eric, who was, he was this just golden boy. He never gave me any trouble. He was very bright. He was recruited by Columbia University. I mean, who does that happen to, right? They were recruiting him. He was for engineering of all things. And he was a loving, kind, caring kid. He was a very brilliant jazz pianist. And he went on to Columbia because that was his dream school because he could play piano and study engineering at the same time. Like there's no place else you can do that, right? You're right in the middle of New York. So he went off to Columbia, got to Columbia, did fabulous. He was elected to student government right away because he didn't badmouth the other candidates. I guess there was a lot of negative campaigning going on there, and he just stood up and said what he could do and didn't let anybody bother him and just focused on what he would do for the students. Won a position on the student council and had a wonderful first semester. He fell in love, got in the jazz program. He was even acting in some plays with the Barnard students, so he was having this absolutely top of the world first semester at Columbia. And he came home for Christmas and was so happy. And it was just wonderful for us to see. He even made the dean's list in engineering. I mean, you just can't write this stuff. It just doesn't happen. And he went off to his second semester. And about 2 weeks in, his girlfriend broke up with him. And that very impulsive brain, which made him such a good jazz pianist, but which was only 19 years old and not quite fully developed in critical thinking and how to get out of difficult situations, took his life 45 minutes after the breakup.
Wow.
And it was just crazy. It shouldn't have happened. So many things could have happened, could have prevented that. Yet we lost him. And then when Eric died, our family's world just fell apart. It shattered into a million pieces. And anyone that's lost a child knows your view of the world, how the world's supposed to work, but everything falls apart. You can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't read, you can't think. We were just a wreck. We were at the bottom of the grief pit with maybe a half of a nostril sticking out, trying to get some breath in. I mean, it was just a horrible, horrible place, as anyone knows. And my husband and I were practicing in Farmington, and we eventually had to go back to work, right? We had to do that, and we were able to do that, which is hard in a profession where you're greeting people all day long, and everyone in the town knew Eric and loved Eric, and so it was a very, very difficult time. But something happened to me early on, after going back to work, that was a huge benefit, and that is another grief pit dweller was there. It happened to be the cousin of my husband. And I walked out of the door one day after work, and he was talking with my husband. They were having a deep discussion, and he came over to me, almost kind of ran, and he was wagging his finger at me. I'm in the zombie stage. I'm a grieving mother. I can hardly breathe. And he wagged his finger at me, and he said, "Don't you ever let your remaining children feel that they are not enough." And it hit me like a lightning bolt. Like, you're judging my grief. What are you doing? And then it hit me. He had lost his brother at about the same age, at about 19. And like many, many cases, and what may have even happened to us, is that he lost his parents at the same time because they were so profoundly grieving. They were at the bottom of that pit, just like me, with one nostril sticking up, and they couldn't get out. So he essentially lost his parents when he lost his brother. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I looked at my husband, who had just had a liver transplant for liver cancer like 6 months before. So he was struggling with other things as well. And then I looked at my daughters, my remaining daughter, one of whom, the youngest, was in law school. And of course, when you're grieving, you can't read, you can't think, you can't process. So I mean, what a terrible place to be when you're trying to grieve. And I realized at that point, I had to fight and kick and scrape and scream my way out of that pit. And I was able, with a lot of effort and a lot of work, to get to the point where I can now live. And this is what I hope your listeners will understand, that no matter how deep you are in that pit of grief, it is possible, but it's not easy. It's not going to happen by itself. It is possible to get to a point where you can have joy in your life again, and you can live your life looking clearly at your life without that shroud. Because when you're living in grief, anyone who's been there knows you're living with this shroud around you that, you see the world, but it's very hazy. You can eliminate that shroud. You can learn to live with joy again, with the memory, and you keep your memory of the people that you lost with you at all times, but in a safe spot. and you can live your life with joy. And it's been it took a while, took years. I wish I could say I wanted to like just say, well, I just want to go to sleep like Rip Van Winkle and wake up in 20 years and be better, right? But you can't. You have to process the grief. You have to process it. I wish we didn't have to, but you do. And I was able to come out of it. And I think that, and my husband, when he passed away a few years later, a few just years ago, actually, really, I think from a broken heart, his heart was great before his liver transplant because they don't give you a liver if your heart's bad.
Yeah.
And a year after Eric died, he was suffering with he needed a quadruple bypass and a valve replaced, and eventually died of congestive heart disease, which I believe is untreated depression. I think that I was treated. Now I do suffer from depression. Obviously, my mother took her life. My son took his life. Brother and sister were both hospitalized. So I'm treated for depression, but I'm treated well, and I'm out of that pit. And I just want people to know it's possible. It's hard, but it's possible to be there, because you feel like when you're in the bottom of the pit, you're never going to get out. You're going to be there forever, and it's a horrible place to be. So I just, I really want to just your listeners to just know you got to fight and keep fighting, and you're going to fall down again, but just keep fighting to get back up, because you can get there. It is possible.
Yeah, I love that message that you're sending to people. And, you talk about, losing a loved one to suicide is just that much more difficult. And you try to make sense of it and you try to reason with it. But I remember after my ex-husband committed suicide, we went to a grief counseling group. And one of the things they said really resonated with me and it made sense. And they said, mental illness is a disease. And it's like cancer. Some people heal from cancer and some people die from it. It's the same thing with mental illness, but we don't punish people who had cancer, So I think people who maybe struggle with, but, my loved one committed suicide, I always try to give that message out there. I don't personally believe that there's a hell like we are taught to believe in it, in traditional religion. And I feel like it's just like illness. Like if someone died and they had cancer and they go to the other side, they're healed of the cancer, same thing. So I know that this had to be a really, really hard journey for you. And I commend you for helping other people try to get to the other side, because it's not an easy thing. And I've watched, a family member after losing my mom grieve in a completely unhealthy way, and almost self-destruct. And that is equally tough to watch. So how do you, because I'm sure you had to help your children through that as well.
Yeah. And one thing that I have to say is, having lost my mother 35 years before my son, there's been such a wonderful change in organized religion from my mother to my son. When my mother died, nobody would give her a funeral. She couldn't be buried in the church. She couldn't have a funeral in the church. And so as a 17-year-old, I had to stand at her coffin in this mortuary, like just dripping with shame, It was terrible. And she was the most loving, kind person you would ever imagine, and a very, very godly one. When my son died, now we were Baptists, and he went to a Catholic school. He was in Columbia. He wasn't even at school anymore. He went to St. Thomas Academy. He wasn't at school anymore. Yet, for his funeral, first of all, they had a funeral, and it was enormous. There were thousands of people there. At his funeral, St. Thomas Academy, a Catholic boys' school, sent buses of boys in their dressed uniforms, it's kind of military academy, in their dressed uniform, buses of Catholic boys in their dressed uniforms over to a Baptist church. He sent the orchestra over, because he was a band leader, sent the orchestra over. And that church was full of these young men who we could give a message to of, don't do this, look at the result. He didn't know what he was doing, but now you do know what he was doing. So don't ever do this. We were able to give a message. And they, one of the best gifts we ever had was when they were taking Eric's coffin down the aisle, the boys, hundreds of boys in their dressed uniforms, stood up and saluted his coffin. I get goosebumps even talking about it, with tears in their eyes as we were walking down with his coffin. So that and one of the Catholic priests that used to work with Eric used to call him the dancing bear, and I just happened to run into him, and he was dying. He was on oxygen. He was dying of cancer. And he said, he knows where he is. He's not, he goes, I can't wait to see him. I'm going to see him soon. So that idea, which made it so much more difficult for survivors who have a faith in something beyond this life, to feel that their loved ones were excluded now, from that because of this act, that's change. And so I'm so glad to see that, because when Eric died, I was also grieving my mother's death, and all of the things that went with that. And it was such a gift to me as a survivor from St. Thomas Academy, from this Catholic school and the people there, and also from our Baptist church. They were supportive as well, with the same message that you gave about depression being a disease. So I was very fortunate, but I know, having been to other funerals with other people, it's still, even today in some areas, it's still considered very shameful. I went to one funeral of a young boy, and the school wouldn't let any of the kids come at all. Eric wasn't even there anymore. He had moved on, and the whole school came. But in this school, the young man was a senior, similar thing. Girlfriend broke up, took his own life. He was a senior, he was a hockey player. Nobody could come to the funeral unless they had to go through so many hoops. So they were like 8 kids that could actually get out of school. And they didn't put them in the yearbook because they were afraid, we don't want people to think we're going to, honor this young man who took his life. And so that still exists. So luckily I had the good side of it, but still today we have the other side, and it's just so sad. And it makes the recovery even more difficult for those that are trying to survive. And there's enough shame to begin with. I mean, what does Eric and my mother have in common? Me, so there's so much shame and guilt on my part, but it's false shame and it's false guilt. And I had to work and get rid of that. It took a long time. I had to get rid of that, and before I could get out of the pit. And so I think for those that are facing that, Eric's reaction to a breakup was not correct. I mean, the girl that broke up with him should have broken up with him if she didn't love him, right? I mean, you don't stay with someone, if you don't love them when you're at that age, right? So I think that's the reaction was not the correct reaction, but he didn't really know what he was doing. He did not realize. I know when I was at that point, it's so painful. Life seems so painful. You just can't take another breath, and you don't realize the effect it has on anybody else. You just think everyone's better off without you. You don't realize that effect. So he didn't understand that. So I do also try to help people understand that, yes, you do. There is an effect. So please think twice. Don't do this. There is an effect on the people that you leave behind.
Yeah, and then you're talking about all the guilt that you felt, but that's one of the stages of grief, is that guilt. And people experience that for so many reasons, whether, you experienced it because you thought you having the link between your mom and your son, maybe that's why this happened. But so many other people, experience guilt because maybe they didn't talk to their loved one as much as they should have, or they didn't tell them they loved them the last time, or they didn't do this, or they didn't do that. How did you get through the guilt? Like, what are some things that you did to help you try to work through that and pass that particular emotion?
I have a very dear friend who wrote, her name is Jessica Metcalf, and she wrote a book called Speak Kindly, You're Listening. And her message really is one that I used, that whenever I would get down on myself and I'd start sinking into the pit, and my brain, that ticker tape that goes around in your brain, what if, if only I'd done this, if only I'd done that, what if only, all those things that just naturally go around in your brain. She said, speak to yourself like you would speak to someone that you loved. If your child was going through this, what would you tell your child about that? Would you say, yeah, you're the one, it's your fault? I mean, of course not. You would say, no, you weren't there. You weren't part of this equation. You love that boy more than anything, and I think stop for a second and ask yourself what you would tell a loved one facing the same situation, because we're so hard on ourselves that we tend to start to go downward spiral into the pit, because we start that ticker tape and we can't stop it. So we have to just stop for a minute and say, what would I tell my child if she was going through this? And you would tell your child something very different, and you would be telling the truth to your child. So you're telling the truth to yourself. It's a lie. And I think I think I had to, in my mind, identify it as a lie. And when that lie came into my head, I'd just say, that's a lie. And I would I throw it out with sing a hymn or I toss it out of my brain with something else. But I would identify it in my brain as a lie. It's a falsehood. It's a lie. Don't believe it, and don't let yourself go there. That's what I had to do. But I think also one of the best pieces of advice is to speak kindly to yourself, as you would somebody else.
Yeah, a lot of the thoughts that we have after trauma are irrational. We think that there's something we could have done, should have done, we, as you said, beat ourselves up so much, but we put ourselves in our own mental prison because we are holding ourselves to these high standards. And when we sit down, if we realize, like I talk about this in my book too, that after my mom died, she had cancer, we were looking up every way, every natural alternative that, we could. And of course, we would say to ourselves, well, we should have tried that. We should have done this. We should have done that. And I had to actually sit down and say to myself, okay, what am I telling myself? I'm telling myself I didn't do enough. But if I sit down and make a list of all the things that we did try, you can see the evidence that we were trying really, really hard. We're not super people. We can only do what we can do. And you have to look at that reality and say, okay, I'm telling myself that I didn't do enough. But if I look at the reality and I see all the things I've written down that we did to try to help her, it just shows that that's an irrational thought. That's a lie that I keep telling myself, that I'm torturing myself with. And I think that that's a really good exercise for people to do, and talking kindly to yourself too. I mean, that's so important.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I write about in my book, Are You Ready? How to Build a Legacy to Die For, is now that I'm by myself. Okay, my husband's dead. My whole family, they tend to, their expiration date tends to be around 56 or so. And so I'm 68. So I've got, so in my mind, it's like, oh, I've got some bonus years here. I realize that I'm next. So what can I do to prepare my two daughters and my six grandchildren for the time when I go? Because I'm going to go, and I want to go first. I don't want anybody coming ahead of me because I had that, I want to go first. I don't want to go through that again. And so I think it's really important that we try to emotionally prepare our children and our grandchildren for a time when we're no longer with them. And I hope that's one of the goals in my life now. Because right now, like, we usually you go through these stages in your life. You go to school, you graduate, college, graduate, go on to, make a living, kids go to school, you have all these things in your life. Well, I'm in the stage where I'm between menopause and death. So those are the two sides that I have, right? So I'm past the menopause part. I'm looking at the death part. And so I think that that's one of the things that we can do to help our family members that we don't do in our society or in our culture, is discuss with them that the inevitability of our death, and we are going to die at some point. I'm going to stay alive as long as I can, but there's going to come a time. And I would like to do whatever I can to make that a softer landing for them after I go. And part of it is just getting all your affairs in order, so you're not fighting over the China, or the, who gets what and all that. Take care of all that beforehand. Get rid of all your stuff, because my kids don't want all my China. I mean, it's breaking my heart, but I have to realize that it's a hard thing for us to do, to prepare for that. But I think that in doing so, we can leave the next generation in better emotional shape, because the grief will be lighter. It's going to be there, but maybe they won't have to go quite so down. Maybe they won't have to get into the part where their nostrils are just hanging above. But I would like to do what we can now to make it easier for our children and our grandchildren to come to terms that death is part of life, and it's inevitable. It's going to happen. And I think that might, I'm hoping that it'll make it easier for my kids, because having gone through, the deaths that I've been through, I've learned a lot. And so I'm hoping I can do that, give that gift to my children of a softer landing when I go.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I don't think we do enough. I mean, we prepare all these people for bringing a life into the world, but we really don't do that much to prepare them for what happens when a life leaves this world. And I think that's so beneficial. It would have been a huge benefit for us to have had someone who sat down with us and said, this is what's happening and here's what's going to happen, and to be made aware so it wasn't such a shock. Even though you know your loved one is sick, it's still a shock. And the way that it ended up was still a shock for us because she was getting better, and then all of a sudden the bottom just fell out, and it was after having the last chemo that she had because her body just didn't react well to it, and things can just change in the blink of an eye. So having, I know they have death doulas. Having somebody like that, is that something that you do?
I'm a certified death doula. Yes.
Wow.
I did that before writing my book because I wanted to make sure I had the information. And you're right. And you know what when you talk about your situation, so often I run into families that they're in the room, someone is very ill and likely to pass away. And the family, because they don't want to admit that death is a possibility, they feel that somehow admitting that death is a possibility betrays their loved one because they want their loved one to believe that they have hope and you're not going to die, we're going to live. So it's a tough time to talk about those things. So what I'd like people to start doing is getting all those affairs in order beforehand, like when you're not deathly ill. And then if the time were to come, for instance, I have my legacy book all written, everything my kids are going to need in one binder, including the titles to my car and all those documents, my social security card, all that stuff is in one binder. So when I go, they know where the binder is. They just open the binder and everything is there. They don't have to go through all my drawers. They don't have to, try to search for things while they're grieving my loss. They can just grieve my loss and then everything else should be a lot easier. So I've seen so many times when people are trying to do this when they're actively dying. And I just think it's easier to do it while we're actively living and we live beyond that. And of course, sometimes we have a sudden death. My family tends to die of a sudden heart attack. So, with no warning. So if that were to happen, I'm ready. And that's kind of the title of my book. I'm ready, get ready. So that when that time comes, it's a gift to your children and you're saying to your children, I'm going to die sometime. So at that point, here's your book. It's going to happen. Here's your book. And then I have letters to them that they'll open up after I'm gone that just remind them how much I love them, kind of speaking beyond the grave. And I've got some letters for like my grandchildren, if they were to get married, there's a letter for the wedding day. If they were to have a child, there's a letter for that. When they graduate from high school, which I hope they all do, there's a letter for that. So I'm trying to really encourage all of us to live our lives with our legacy in mind. So often in our culture, we live our lives kind of what can the world do for us? I want a big car, and I want to do this, and I want to do that. I want to, that's what our culture tells us. Whereas where you get true happiness, if you look at there's a Harvard happiness study. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's 80 years of study. And they found out what we all really knew, but it's great to have a study from Harvard for 80 years. It just reinforces that it's our relationships that make us happy. And it's not the stuff. And besides that, when you're my age, the stuff is a burden because you got to get rid of it because your kids don't want it. So it's not the stuff. The stuff is worthless. It's the relationships you have. And so if you live with that legacy in mind, that I want to build relationships, I want to make life better for the next generation that comes along, there's so much joy and so much happiness that comes from that. It's just unbelievable. And then you pass that joy and happiness on to other people because you're joyful. That's why, I could have stayed in that pit and drowned in there because that's probably where I was headed if my nephew hadn't intervened. But living outside the pit is wonderful. And I would love if my children can all stay out of the pit as much as possible. You'll go there. We all go there during periods of our lives. I hope their days are short.
What are some of the things that you did that helped to bring joy back into your life again?
Well, a year after I lost my son, so I was still in the grieving pit, and I was the primary breadwinner of the family at the time. My husband worked 2 days a week because he was still recovering, and I worked full time as a dentist. But I was having some neck trouble, so all of a sudden I went to Mayo to fix my neck, and they said, "Whoops, your good hand, I have a bad hand. My good hand, the good hand, I have permanent nerve damage in the drilling fingers on my good hand from my neck. Now that my neck, depending on where the damage was, it could have been my toes or some other place, but of all places
Yeah.
for this to happen, it's the only three good fingers I have, right? So it's like, okay, Lord, come on, come on, what's going on here? I mean, that's kind of how I felt. And so after that happened, I went from working full time to not working again, and I was a breadwinner. So that was another reinventing of myself, trying to figure, okay, what do I do now, right? So I decided I was going to become a grief counselor. And I went through grief counselor training, and I learned something was called Worden's 4 tasks of mourning. You hear about the Kubler-Ross, the stages of grief, and Worden's 4 tasks of mourning. I clung to that because it was tasks, and I like tasks because that means you have to work at it. It doesn't just happen. I just love the way he worded that. And those tasks were accepting the loss, which took a while, processing the grief, coming to terms with your new identity, and then the last one is finding a place to hold your loved one and getting on with your life. So I found that was a big help, because what that did for me is it gave me a goal. So like I'm really deep in the pit. I want to get halfway up the pit this year. So I'm going to work on this. I'm going to work on that. That helped me a lot. And then over time for the first 5 or 6 years after Eric died, I didn't want any grandchildren, because Erica was going to have the kids. The girls were not going to have any children. I didn't want grandchildren because I didn't want to love anybody like that again. Because it was like, if I just have a small group, I'll only love these 3. And then if something happens to them, there's less likelihood. The bigger the number gets, the more likely something, it's crazy talk in your head. It's just crazy talk. But that's how, I was in that crazy land. And then my daughters got married, and my daughters, who were not going to have children, by the way, now have 6 between them. So thank you, children. And the first ones were a set of twins. We went from no grandchildren to twins right away. And I think that embracing, new life was helpful, and not everybody has grandchildren. But it's a help to embrace them if your relationships are good. But embracing my relationships with other people, I have a wonderful, wonderful group of friends, women friends that I've just had for 30, 40 years. I have a wonderful support group. Our church is a big support group. I have book club. I have other support groups. And I just kept focusing on moving up into the pit with joy at the top. And I just visualized, okay, I'm moving up. I'm not there yet, and I had to fake it for a while. I had to kind of smile as much as I could. And eventually that internal heart, my heart just started lightening and lightening and lightening. I wish I could say it just took a couple of weeks. It was years. Probably, I think maybe the first year, I don't remember. The next few years, I think I was working my way out of the pit. Maybe I got about most of the way out by about the 5th year. And by the 10th year, I was completely out. But it took 10 years to really get out, where I could truthfully say that I could speak to you without that downer shroud coming up. And
I think that's the important thing for people to remember, is that you need to have patience with yourself through this process, because there's no time limit that says you're going to feel better by any certain amount of time. Then don't put expectations on yourself. And I don't think others should put expectations on people who are grieving, because everyone is different and everyone's process is different. Really just have grace with yourself and patience with yourself throughout this journey.
Absolutely. And I had a woman, one of our employees in our dental office, had lost her son the same way, the one who no one showed up at the funeral. It was my dental hygienist. And I remember maybe a year or 2 after she lost her son, because she lost her son before I lost my son. I remember about a year or so, and she would do her best. She came in, she was wonderful. I love this woman. She would do her best, but you could tell, that the shroud was still there. And I remember even me, with I'd been through a lot even then, thinking, well, I wonder when she's going to get over it. I wonder when she's, I wonder if she's going to get back to normal. I mean, I thought that myself. Shame on me. I thought that myself. And then it happened to me, So I think we really do need to remember not ever to judge anybody else's grief, and to understand that there are some people, like my husband's cousin's parents, who can never find their way out. It's going to happen to some people. Don't judge them. Just be gracious to them and do your best. Just all we can do is what we can do for us, right? Just do your best to get out, but don't judge anybody else or expect that they should be out or there's a time limitation or, because it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's really hard because sometimes you just have to love people where they are, and that a lot of times they're not in a good place, but there's not really anything that you can personally do because if someone's not ready to process their grief, it's not going to happen. They have to be ready to take those steps.
You just have to love them, sit with them, love them, be there for them. You can't.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. I mean, you've been through so much, but I love that you're sharing your journey to help others heal. I know you have a book that you've had several, I think, books that you've had written out. So tell us a little bit about your work. Like, what are you doing now? How are you helping people? And how can people find you?
One of the ways through grief is you have to reinvent yourself. Like, so suddenly you're not a mother anymore. I'm not a practicing dentist anymore. I had to figure out something else. So we're constantly reinventing yourself. And one of the things that I had to learn when my husband died is, to reinvent myself alone, that I'm enough alone. And it's, as anyone would attest, when you come home and you are alone now, like permanently, it takes a lot of getting used to. So at that point in time, I realized that I needed to focus on what can I do now as I'm moving towards, death, but hopefully a few years out, but I'm in my fourth quarter, I can do the math, right?
Yeah.
And I started writing it down in a book, and I did a lot of research for about 18 months. And I wrote a book called Are You Ready? How to Build a Legacy to Die For. And the first part of the book talks about, I've also had the privilege of meeting some incredible people in my 68 years. A Holocaust survivor. I have a lot of friends in Rwanda, and they of course are the forgiveness capital of the world. I have stories of people that I've just known who are amazing, have done amazing jobs and left amazing legacies. Art, hard work, all of those things, joy, love. And so the first part of the book just talks about all these different legacies you can leave for your family. Second part talks about death and dying. That's where my death doula training came in. And then the third part of it talks about all the things we need to do so that when we die, rather than having to grieve us and then try to find all the documents that people need and try to fight over if there's no will, which in most cases there is not, trying to fight over who gets what and having the state take all the money and the lawyers take all, to get as much of that done as you can beforehand so that your kids can come, as my kids will do, sit down, open up the binder, and everything that they will need to take care of my estate will be in that binder. I'm also recommending too, because one of the big problems after you die is the cleanup, right? You got to take care of all your stuff, right? Yeah. And there are companies out there now who knew all over the country that you can employ. And I put money in my will to take care of this company. They'll come in, they'll clean up your stuff, and they'll take off and they'll distribute it themselves. So you can actually arrange it so nobody in your family is stuck, taking care of you. Kind of like that, what you learned in kindergarten, clean up your mess.
Yeah.
You can put in your will to how to have your mess cleaned up so that nobody has to do it. So I'm really just trying to look at everything I can look at for, so that when I die, my goal now is to live a very full life, to be adventure grandma for my grandchildren, live experiences. But when I die, I want it to be as simple as possible for my children so I can build their relationship even closer, because that's my true legacy, is my children and my family living in love with each other and having that close relationship.
Awesome. Well, where can people find your book, or if they want to follow you or work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, the book's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Are You Ready? How to Build a Legacy to Die For? But you can also find a link for it on my website, which is Dr. Kimberly Harms, drkimberlyharms.com. So drkimberlyharms.com. And
I'll have
everything.
A link for that in the show notes too. So I'll put a link to your website so people can easily find it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And this has been, it's very therapeutic, by the way, to do these podcasts, because you get to talk, It's like free therapy.
Yes, for me as well. Yes, it's very therapeutic. I want to thank you so much for everything that you're doing, all the work you're doing, and for coming on here and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. Um, I know it's been a tough journey for you, but thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about it.
And thank you, Melissa, and good luck.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for being here with us as well. As always, if you like this podcast, please subscribe. Please leave a positive review from wherever you're listening. And the greatest compliment you can pay me is to share this podcast with anyone you think might benefit. I also wanted to let you know that my book, Beautiful Morning, just became available on audiobook. I spent most of June recording the audiobook for it. And it's now available on Nook, audiobooks.com, Apple Books, Google Play, and Spotify. So you can go check that out. The link is also in the show notes. I hope you guys have an amazing week. I am sending you so much love and light, and I will talk to you soon. Bye, guys.